Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for a conversation between Kathleen Cahill, author of Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement, and Allison Parker, the author of Unceasing Militant, The Life of Mary Church Terrell. This event is part of the Off the Shelf series, a co-production of the university libraries at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and UNC Press. These events are designed to present new works published by the press that explore racial and social justice in our history and our world. My name is Shatra Powell, and I am the African American Collections and Outreach Archivist for the Southern Historical Collection here at UNC Libraries. Before I introduce the authors joining us today, I do want to make a couple of notes. First, we are grateful to the UNC Women's and Gender Studies Department for co-sponsoring today's talks, and we give our thanks to the department for helping us celebrate Women's History Month. I was also grateful to have a chance to meet with the authors last week to plan for today's conversation, and all three of us are really excited for this opportunity to make connections between these works, share more of the author's research journey, and try to understand how these histories are intricately connected to this moment in American history. So we'll plan to talk for about 35 to 40 minutes and then open the floor to audience questions. And actually you can drop in your questions through the Q&A section throughout, and we'll moderate and address them at the end. And without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our guest, and we will get started with our conversation. It's way faster than I thought it would be. Okay, so our first guest is Kathleen Kale. She is the author of Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement. Kathleen is an associate professor of history at Penn State University and the author of Federal Fathers and Mothers, A Social History of the United States Indian Service, 1869 to 1933. She's the winner of the 2011 Labriola Center American Indian National Book Award and finalist for the 2012 David J. Weber Clements Prize from the Western History Association. Allison Parker, who is the author of Unceasing Militant, is the History Department Chair and Richards Professor of American History at the University of Delaware. Parker is also the author of Articulating Rights, 19th Century American Women on Race, Reform, and the State. And she also wrote Purifying America, Women, Cultural Reform, and Pro-Censorship Activism, 1873 to 1933. Parker also serves as co-editor of the Gender and Race in American History book series for the University of Rochester Press. So we have some dynamic writers, researchers, and educators here with us today. And to kick us off, I just wanted Kathleen to talk a little bit about a brief overview of your book for our audience.
Sure, thank you. And thank you everyone for being here and spending your lunch hour with us. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. So my book, Recasting the Vote, is essentially a collective biography of 6 women of color who participated in the suffrage movement and were quite active in a variety of political issues and reforms. And essentially, I look at 3 Native women, Mariebotne Baldwin, a Turtle Mountain Chippewa woman, Gertrude Bonin, or Zitkalasa, who is Yankton, Dakota, and Laura Cornelius Kellogg, who's Wisconsin Oneida. And then I also write about a woman, African-American poet and activist named Carrie Williams Clifford, a Chinese-born woman who lived most of her life in the US named Mabel Panquali, and a woman from New Mexico named Adelina or Nina Otero Warren, who identified as Hispana. We might call her Latina today, but we can sort of talk about that. And I look at how their stories overlap, but also diverge to think about why different women came to suffrage and saw the right to vote as an important and powerful political tool.
And Alison, do you want to share a little bit about your book as well?
Sure, I'm happy to. So my book, instead of being a collective biography, is a biography of one woman, and that is Mary Church Terrell. She was born enslaved in Memphis, Tennessee in 1863 during the Civil War, and lived until she was until she was almost 91 in 1954, at the time after the Brown v. Board decision. So she was active for over 60 years as a feminist, a suffragist, a civil rights activist. And so my story isn't just a suffrage story, or not that that's just, but it's something that covers a lot more territory. And so her feminism is really highlighted throughout, and her role in the suffrage movement has a more secondary role as compared to Kathleen's book that's more fully on suffrage and all of the kind of women's rights issues that surround that.
Yeah. I wonder, Allison, thinking about the title of your book, how did you arrive at Unceasing Militant?
I called it Unceasing Militant because that's the term that Paul Robeson uses in his eulogy for her after she dies. And I thought it was pretty apt because basically he was commending her for never giving up the fight, for persisting for so many decades as an activist in spite of the rise of Jim Crow and all of the various obstacles that civil rights activists faced. And it also connects her to someone more clearly on the left, which I thought was an important thing, because she has often been seen as a more conservative club woman, which she was, but she also had this much richer, longer, and complicated history. And so I was hoping that that would help kind of shed some light on that other aspect of her life.
I wonder, Kathleen, too, just thinking about nuances of 6 different women and how you came up with your title and how you wanted, what you hope to convey.
That was actually a really difficult part of the book because I was talking about women from multiple different groups. And so finding a title that sort of allowed me to signal that, but I didn't want to use non-white, right? That's a defining by absence, but I also didn't want to just list African-American, Native American, whatever. And even the first part of the title was tough. But I ended up with recasting the vote to sort of emphasize that this changes our story. And I have to say that phrase actually was suggested to me by my good friend, Mary Mendoza, who's my colleague here at Penn State. And it was perfect because I was really struggling. But the women of color portion, again, was hard to come up with a category that didn't flatten. And so I use it in the title, but I hope that I actually undermine it a bit in the book by demonstrating that these women do have some similar experiences, especially as they engage with white suffragists and white society more broadly, some of the discrimination and the prejudice that they face. But they're also really different, and that their motivations differ, their concerns differ. And so I hope that the book actually kind of undermines that category as well. But it was certainly a question that I was really kind of going back and forth on, and it was really a hard, needle to thread.
Yeah, I mean, I get the sense of talking to you both that your books are a response to an absence of this nuance. So I wonder if you could each kind of reflect on, what inspired you to write your books and how you want to challenge some of the dominant histories about suffrage or Mary Church Terrell. Allison, do you want to take a first stab at that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I started this project well over a decade ago when I was actually writing my book on articulating rights, where I was looking at Black and white women's political thought in the 19th century. And at that point, I was doing something that was almost like a version of mini biographies, although it was focusing a lot more on their intellectual thought. But I read deeply into the biographies of each woman to try to make sure that I knew as much as I could about her while I was thinking about her political thought. And when I got to Mary Church Terrell, there was a rich history of her by Black women's historians going all the way back to the late 70s, but it was embedded in books about the women's club movement and other kinds of things. And there was actually no full-length biography of her written by a scholar or basically anyone else in the last 50 or 60 years. And so I was so shocked by that. And I had already become very interested in her as a thinker. And it made me think that I might want to, when I was done with that project, turn to a biography of her for that very reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about you, Kathleen? What made you want to write this book?
So it sort of came out of two different places. My first book, Federal Fathers and Mothers, was looking at particularly women who worked for the Office of Indian Affairs. It becomes the Bureau, or Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA. And that's where I met Mariebotne Baldwin and actually Gertrude Bonnen at Kalasa. And Baldwin had participated in the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. So I sort of knew that portion of her story, but I didn't include it in the first book. And then as actually kind of all of the discussions around the Civil War sesquicentennial were happening, I was thinking, you know, this suffrage centennial is coming up, and maybe I should write something about her, you know, explore a little more about why she was interested in suffrage, because that didn't really fall into the categories that the sort of assumptions I had about suffrage. And there's a scholar in Native Studies named Phil Deloria who has this amazing book called Indians in Unexpected Places. And he encourages us to think about, like, why do we think it's unexpected to find Native people in places like a suffrage parade, right? What does that tell us? And so I started with her story, and I thought maybe it would just be an article, something quick. And as I started looking at that 1913 parade, I realized there was more diversity than we often discuss, right? That scholars often discuss. There had been some conversation, again, as you were saying, Allison, Black women historians and scholars had written a little bit about African-American women's participation, but I was finding even more diversity than that. So it just kind of snowballed from Mariebotne Baldwin into kind of a larger project about different women that don't get included in that story, and why we didn't think about them as suffragists.
Yeah, that response makes me think about the archives and that image from 1913. You know, you see all of these different activists, and then for you to take that step to understand what brought them there. And I think that's pretty special about both of your books, is that a lot of the work is in the voice of the women themselves in the collections. And so I wonder, Allison, if you could talk a little bit about your experience in the archives and how that came together for you.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's possibly overwhelming about Mary Church Terrell is that she actually has a lot of papers. She was very interested in preserving her own history and her place in history. And she approached the Library of Congress before she died and basically invited and asked them to take her papers. And she negotiated an agreement, and many of her documents are in fact at the Library of Congress. And then another set of her papers are at Howard University's Morgan Spingarn collection, and that's also a quite substantial number of papers. And so her own archival collecting papers, you know, especially some. Oops, are we back? Are we back?
There you are.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
So in any case, it's an exciting thing because the papers that the family still had, we were able to donate through their desire to her. Oberlin College. So a lot of those papers are available. So I also know from these 3 repositories.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, so much of our work in the libraries is trying to identify where papers are, how can we connect scholars to them, and so to see how your work and the kind of diverse ways that you're reaching out to families and also using established repositories. And thinking about, Kathleen, you had more people to investigate, and I'm imagining there was a diversity of access and availability. Can you talk a little bit more about that experience?
Yeah, sure. And it was a really different experience. I actually thought initially that this might be more of a synthetic book where I would sort of draw on secondary literature. So I hadn't anticipated being, in the archives as much as I was. One of the things I would say, let's see, 2 of the women that I write about have sort of substantial archival collections, and even those are not huge. They're nothing like the Mary Church Terrell papers, which, right, I'm very jealous. But so Gertrude Bonin has some papers at BYU, and Nina Otero Warren has some at the State Archives in New Mexico. But much of what I drew upon were actually the digitized newspapers. That's fairly recent in terms of the life of writing a book. And I was able to mine those to see kind of a lot of, we might call it kind of networking, or where women were coming together to have conversations. So often it was, just little snippets of who was at a meeting and where, and maybe what the speech they gave was titled. And that allowed me to kind of really find some places to dig further in. With someone like Carrie Williams Clifford, most of what she left was her 2 published books of poetry. And she really used her poetry to think about history, but also kind of the history she was living through. She would write about kind of contemporary events. So she writes about World War I. She writes about the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial. So I was able to sort of use some of that as well. And all of them were substantial speakers. So some of their speeches were published and things like that. But it really was much more of a kind of broad and spread out set of archives. The one I really felt so lucky to access was that for Mabel Pinkhua Lee, her father founded the first Chinese Baptist church in New York City, and she later becomes the administrator of that church for many, many years. And the church still exists, and the congregation still really keeps her memory alive, and has a number of her papers and some really beautiful images that the family had. And they have been extremely generous in talking to me and sharing some of that with me. I do not read Chinese, so that limited me because a lot of her papers are in Chinese character. But again, they have translated some things, and their generosity was really, really astonishing and wonderful.
I just keep thinking too about how the archives lend themselves to this really deep and detailed investigation of their lives and these moments and times, and thinking about how those intersect across your 2 books. And so I know, like, the 1913 suffragette parade for the Woodrow Wilson inauguration. Can you each talk about how you situate that moment in your books? Maybe Allison, you could speak to it first.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we need to start out with is the way that women of color have been portrayed in that parade. And basically how we start is with their absence. And so the story, which is partially true, but also partially not true, has been popular in especially popular culture. But it's the idea that Alice Paul, trying to cater to Southern white women, made an edict that Black women should not participate in the parade at all. And there wasn't really a discussion of other women of color, in fact, but just talking about Black women shouldn't participate. And then there was a lot of protest, especially by Black women. And then eventually she said, well, they can march at the back of the parade. So that's the story. And that's true. But then the next part goes, and Ida B. Wells was, the only woman who decided to defy this edict and march with the Illinois delegation rather than at the back of the parade. And that's where the story gets it wrong. She did, in fact, do that too. However, it erases all the other women who were at the parade. And so on my part, I knew that it couldn't be true that Mary Church Terrell had agreed to march at the back of the parade, especially if she never ever complained about it the rest of her life. If she had been, dissed like that, she would have talked about it. Mm-hmm. So I knew from the beginning that it couldn't be true. And so I started doing research and looking through all of these different newspapers, especially to see the reports from the day and the day after, and found lots and lots of reports of Black women marching throughout the parade. The parade was organized as a processional, and there were places where you could come in as homemakers, nurses, teachers, all kinds of things. And then all the states were at the very back of the parade. Mm-hmm. So technically, Ida B. Wells and even Mary Church Terrell and the National Association of Colored Women were marching at the back because they were in state delegations. And Mary Church Terrell and the NACW women were invited to march with the New York City delegation inside of the New York delegation. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, she was involved in the negotiations to make sure that the Delta Sigma Theta sorority members could march as sorority women within Howard as a college delegation with the other white college delegations. So that's part of the myth. And then I'll turn it over to Kathleen to share the other aspects of the myth that she's helped debug.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that, we had corresponded a couple times about this, because exactly, a lot of the literature or a lot of the documentaries would say that it was this segregated parade. And again, that's not what I was necessarily seeing in the sources. Carrie Williams Clifford writes the kind of report for the crisis, where she talks about where Black women were marching in these different, sort of sections. She marches with the homemakers, with another Black woman from South Carolina. So I knew that wasn't true. But then, as I said, I came to the parade from the point of view of Indigenous women. And one of the things I kept finding in the newspapers was this story about an Indian princess of the Glacier Park Indians, who was supposed to be coming and to ride in buckskin on her pony, and this whole kind of narrative. And that was all over the newspapers. And so I was trying to track that down, and found that I don't think that person. So first, that person didn't exist as a real person. She is a creation of the public relations machine of the Great Northern Railroad. Her name was Dawn Mist, and she's a character. Now, she's portrayed by actual Native women. In fact, a series of Native women over the years, they'd be hired to play her. She was the leading lady. And I think this was a whole PR thing that the Glacier Park Railroad was trying to gin up attention. And this idea of Native women and suffrage has a long history that I can talk about a little bit, but there's sort of, there was the idea, that some Native cultures are matriarchies, and there was a real interest in that by white suffragists. So a lot of press about this Indian princess. But then what I found was that Mariebotne Baldwin was actually asked to be in the parade. And they asked her to make a float to represent kind of this matriarchal vision of traditional tribal societies. Mm-hmm. And she actually turns them down. And instead, she marches with the lawyers, which, mm-hmm. another profession, because she at the time was enrolled in the Washington College of Law. which was a feminist law school. And so she kind of rejects the idea that she's going to be in buckskin on a float, and instead marches in a cap and gown, a lawyer's sort of regalia. And so kind of finding that in the newspapers first told me I had to be really careful with newspapers and really kind of follow up things that they might say. But secondly, made me realize that sometimes women of color might be in places that I just didn't see them because no one really talked about them there. And the other example from that parade that I like to use is there's a picture that gets republished in things a lot that shows one of the floats just surrounded, right? Because part of the story of that parade is that crowd control by the DC police is awful and that this leads to, right, congressional hearings. But this float just surrounded by a sea of men. And the float itself was a depiction of women in foreign nations who were fighting for suffrage. And what I found is that one of those women is a Chinese woman. She's only described as Mrs. Wu, but once you can tell that's who she is and she's carrying the flag of the new Republic of China, it's very clear that's who she is, right? But she's never identified in that way. So again, these kind of places where women sometimes were in plain sight, but we don't know to look for them. And so that parade, again, those two instances made me realize that there might be more stories there that we just were missing.
Yeah, as I think about the parade maybe being more inclusive but problematic in different ways, but there is still like you could try to divide, the image of white suffragettes versus the women of color. And one of the themes across is, their connection and fight for their communities, as opposed to just for the right to vote. And I think that those historical tensions and issues are, they permeate your books. And so thinking about what those particular issues were that were combined with the right to vote. I wonder, Kathleen, I know you're just so complex, if you could kind of share some of those themes with us.
Sure. So one of the things, and I think kind of jumping off what I was just talking about, this sort of stereotype of Native people versus kind of how Native women wanted to portray themselves, is a good example of this. So, right, this is a moment in US history where the federal government has stopped recognizing the sovereignty of Native nations. It stopped signing treaties in the 1870s. It is creating this policy of assimilation where there's a real attempt to destroy, again, Native polities, but also Native cultures, and kind of melt Native people into the US citizenry as kind of indistinguishable. And Native people don't agree with that, right? They know that they're members of sovereign nations. They talk about the need to uphold treaty rights in that relationship. And Native women are part of those conversations. And they don't always agree about the relationship to US citizenship and the right to vote. The women I'm looking at argued that because the federal government had stopped recognizing their own nations, they did not, but because the government had, they really needed US citizenship and the vote to influence federal policy. And they're really articulating kind of political theories about dual citizenship, in a sense. And so they're pushing back against these stereotypes of the dawn mist Indian princess, which basically were asserting that Native people couldn't be modern, that they were kind of trapped in the past, they were disappearing, either they were going to die out or they were going to assimilate, but kind of Native people were going to disappear in the future. And the Native suffragists that I'm writing about were really trying to show that they could be modern, that they had, they could exist in places that were seen as detrimental to Native people. And they did this by really playing with that image. So although Baldwin in the parade insisted on this sort of modern lawyer image, she was also willing to kind of dress in buckskin in other moments. And Gertrude Bonnen uses this a lot. She has an outfit that she calls her drawing card because she knows it is of great interest, particularly to suffrage groups, and they'll invite her to speak. And then once she gets on the stage, she described it as in the interests of the Indians of today, right? So again, insisting on this sort of modern issue and emphasizing the treaties and tribal sovereignty, but also the real problems that Native people faced, the boarding schools, the poverty of reservations, and critiques of federal policy. So for Native women, the right to vote, they really see that as a way to protect sovereignty, to get the government to uphold treaty rights. And so they're coming, right, that's a really different agenda than, right, white women or other women of color. But nonetheless, they end up in sort of these same suffrage spaces, trying to educate that audience.
Yeah. Allison, I wonder if you can do a similar reflection on the complex issues that Mary Church Terrell brought to women's right to vote.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Black women suffragists also had a different perspective on the right to vote, and they did see it as part of a community project where for them, they never argued for the individual right of Black women to vote without also talking about the need to make sure that Black men's disenfranchisement was addressed. So Black men had been given the right to vote, but of course, there were a whole series of laws and practices that were put in place that made it incredibly hard, especially by the end of Reconstruction, for them to vote. And these were issues that Mary Church Terrell brought up at every single convention that she went to of predominantly white suffragists. So she went to these conventions and she asked them repeatedly over decades, to take these issues seriously and to understand that they couldn't separate out the needs of Black women to vote from their men. And white women were not interested in this at all. And it creates a problem because they basically say that's a racial issue, it's not a gender issue, it's not something that we should be caring about. And they really had long-term issues with understanding intersectionality, which Mary Church Terrell would always talk about the fact that Black women had two handicaps, as she put it, that white women and Black men didn't have because they were both Black and women. And so she was very much aware of that intersectional nature of the problem that Black women faced, but she and almost all Black women still also saw themselves as in allegiance with Black men to fight for these larger civil rights, including things like anti-lynching.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciated the way that you put Mary Church Terrell in that conversation, from Phyllis Wheatley to Kimberly Crenshaw, that it's all part of this legacy of intellectual thought. Yeah, thinking about other ways that, or like historical things that your books help us understand. I think about the role of colleges and how a lot of these women were college educated. They spent a lot of time on different campuses and what role those places played for them in their lives. I wonder, Allison, if you could reflect on what Oberlin and Howard meant for Terrell.
Yeah, I mean, so for Mary Church Terrell, she attends Oberlin in the high school, preparatory school in the late 1870s, and then graduates in 1884 from Oberlin. And she is proud to be part of a college that from the start, very, very early on, had accepted Blacks and women in a way that others, and this was in the 1830s, so this is very progressive. And that tradition, she felt, made it a pretty welcoming place for her. She sometimes, noted certain kinds of things that she recognized as discrimination from students, like when she didn't win a poetry award that she thought she deserved. She was pretty sure it was because the white young man who won it, got it not entirely based on his talents. And but so there were a few things, but in general, she had a really positive experience there. And when she had her own daughters to take to college, she actually accompanied them for their first semester and lived in Oberlin, I think partially because she loved it so much that she thought she would go with them, but she also wanted to help ease them in to an integrated school when they had been in an entirely segregated public school in Washington, D.C. And this was in 1913, just at the start of the Wilson administration, when Jim Crow laws are going national in a more official way, and the capital is being segregated under his administration. And what she finds is that there's been a huge shift in the culture there, and Black students are not integrated into any events. They're not allowed to socialize in the same kind of way. Her children aren't being invited to the events because they're Black. And she is very, very upset about it. And by the end of the semester, contacts her friends at the National NAACP headquarters to tell them that they needed to start working on this. And it's an issue that W.B. Du Bois, especially a little later in the 1920s, is working on too, partially because he's watching his daughter encounter similar issues. So a lot of these parents become involved in fighting against the prejudice in the colleges because they're seeing their own children face it, even as they had actually attended, like W.B. Du Bois and Mary Church Terrell's husband, Robert Terrell, went to Harvard and didn't experience, in some ways, as much virulent racism as their children did a generation later.
Right. Yeah, just thinking about the diversity of their experiences, thinking in your book, Kathleen, at in Barnard College and Sites of Activism. Can you talk more about the women you know or wrote about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that sort of anecdote that Allison just told was one of the most striking parts of her book for me, that kind of sense that, right, progress isn't, the narrative of history is not always progressive, because it just was such a really striking and heartbreaking story. Colleges are extremely important for the women I'm writing about. So there's a couple ways. First, many of them had gone to college, or at least sort of some kind of finishing school. And so all of the women I read about are pretty elite in terms of their education, kind of Western education. They are in their communities, upper class. And so, that's pretty significant. They may not be as well off as upper class white women, but in their communities relative to them, they are. So they're all coming at it from a particular point of view. College, I think, really gives many of them the kind of speaking skills and rhetorical skills that they then use in their activism. And some of them are really young when they start this activism. So Mabel Pinkhua Lee is 16. She's a high school student when she gives her first big suffrage speech to women like Anna Howard Shaw, who is the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And then she matriculates to Barnard. She's already sort of a known quantity in the suffrage movement. And so Barnard is in New York City. A lot of suffrage headquarters are there. Suffragists are constantly coming through and talking at Barnard. Barnard has sort of founds clubs that are engaging with women's suffrage, and she's involved in all of that. I know she's going to those talks. I know she's in some of these clubs. And so she continues throughout her college career to be really engaged in this. But there's another aspect of her college career that's really essential, and it is that there's a major exchange program with students from China in this period called the Boxer Indemnity Program. And it's mostly men until 1918, but so these men are coming, students are coming to the US. They have like 4-year visas. They cannot immigrate, but they can come, go to school, and then they go back. And China has, in 1911, has a revolution, a Republican revolution, not the Communist Revolution. And they overthrow the Qing Empire, and they establish a republic, the Republic of China. And so the men who are coming to be educated, and the US sets up this program very deliberately, are the future political and economic leaders of that new nation. And so Mabel Lee gets very involved in a national organization called the Chinese Student Alliance, which almost all of these students are part of. And she's in the leadership, she runs for office. She even runs for president of the organization, though she doesn't win. And she is talking very much to them also about women's rights and suffrage, and talking about how, as they build this new nation, they need to incorporate women's rights into it. And so she's really involved in kind of two suffrage movements, or two discussions of women's rights, this kind of transnational conversation about China and the women in China, but also in the US. And her that influences her, right? She's kind of taking arguments from one and moving through. So for her, that's really essential. It's worth noting that at this time, Barnard does allow Chinese women to matriculate. It allows Native women. Laura Cornelius Kellogg studies there briefly, but African-American women are not welcome at Barnard until 1925. I think Zora Neale Hurston's one of the first. So college is really sort of a site where a lot of them either come to suffrage activism or kind of really blossom and are part of these bigger conversations.
And in fact, that's one of the things that I appreciated about what you were talking about when you connect the Chinese American women's activism to their understanding of the revolution and the role that women's suffrage was playing in China as a sign of modernism, of progressive values. And so it's not just an imposition of American values, but also that you're highlighting how they're taking the Chinese history or the experiences in China of that time, and it's informing their own activism in the US. And so that's a part that I really appreciated too.
Thank you. And that's one of the places I think where I really was able to show absolutely how, right, those ideas really influence white suffragists. And it's in the 1912 New York City parade, women from Chinatown march in that parade. It's right after the revolutions happened. Mabel Lee's actually leading this parade, but her mother and some other women are in the middle with the flag of the Republic of China. And Anna Howard Shaw marches literally right behind them with a banner that says NASA, catching up with China, right? And it's precisely this argument that China is more modern than the United States, which is what women like Mabel Lee are saying, that then forces white suffragists or gives them an argument that they pick up to try to shame white men into moving forward. So yeah, that was one of the really clear-cut places where I could see the influence of these women. Thanks, Allison.
I do also want to encourage our audience to submit any questions if they have them, and we have plenty of things to talk about. But if you all have burning questions, feel free to submit them in the Q&A. This recent exchange just reminds me of, that kind of, I don't know, whatever goes on in our brains. Where in one moment we have reverence for Chinese women and their progress with rights, but in the same we have this anti-immigrant sentiment about Chinatowns in New York, and the same thing with Native American women, that there's a pride in that heritage, but for African American people it's still like one drop and it's bad. So just kind of navigating those tensions is a tricky thing to do. And so, before we started, we were talking about the term BIPOC and the idea of, talking about women of color in this group. Does it serve? Who does it serve? How does it serve? Who does it still erase? How do you kind of think about that when you're writing a book like this, Kathleen?
Yeah, I mean, that, as I said, it was something I really struggled with, because as I wrote the book, what I found was, for some of these women, anti-Blackness serves as a tool for other women of color, right, to try to distance themselves, precisely because, as Allison said, particularly around 1913 and the Wilson administration, this Jim Crow is sort of going national, but also someone like Mariebotne Baldwin, who works in Washington, D.C. and lives in Washington, D.C. and is not white, though she has a French heritage that she's proud of, but she's never tries to pass. But she becomes really concerned as a civil servant about the segregation of those spaces. And she turns and attacks a Black doctor in the Indian service. And I think she's doing it as a way to distance herself and to say, I'm not Black, I'm Native, and that's different. And so I shouldn't be kind of put into a category where my office space, right, where I'll have to be segregated. And so she's deploying that anti-Blackness to make claims about her identity and her sort of place. And Nina Otero Warren, as an elite Hispanic woman, does this in New Mexico, particularly with Native women. And so, right, so that category of women of color has to be complicated to acknowledge that Native women and Chinese women, as you say, are sometimes being kind of held up and romanticized in ways that Black women never were by white suffragists, right? And so, I think BIPOC is useful in the sense that it does say that African Americans had a very particular experience, and it acknowledges sort of that Native people also are, right, because they are often racialized and treated as a race, but they're also, they are sovereign nations, right? And so they have a political identity that is very different from other women of color. So it is extremely complicated. And I think we are kind of really feeling our way forward as to how do we, right? And again, not always talking about these women in contrast to white society, but that is what they have in common. But that's not the only kind of way we need to understand them.
Yeah. Thinking about Mary Church Terrell too, navigating identity. I mean, she was sitting at the intersection of a lot of identities. I mean, both of her grandparents or grandfathers were white. And so how do you understand the way she sees herself going? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, to start out, when she was at the Antioch Model School in Ohio, she, as a young girl, getting an education in the North, because that's where her parents sent her, since they didn't see an adequate education option for her in Memphis at the time. She ended up noticing that white and Black children would mock and make fun of Chinese Americans who were on the streets. And she would say, don't do that, because especially to her Black friends, she would say, don't do that, because if you're saying these mocking things to Chinese people, just wait till, the white kids turn around and start mocking you. And so she was aware of those intersectionalities and was willing to fight. She said, sometimes she got into street yard fights with especially the white children, because when they would persist in these taunts to the people who were walking on the street, she would say, look, I like their yellow skin better than your pale faces. Mm-hmm. And, and then that would lead to some kind of altercation in the playground. But she felt pretty strongly about that. And then in terms of the issue of the word colored women, for her at the time, she was very insistent that the term colored be used rather than Negro, or even African, or it wasn't African American, but like Afro-American. And her argument was that colored was a more accurate representation of what Black women in America were. And her point was, because of this one drop rule that you mentioned, Chandra, where, basically almost anyone who has any, kind of African heritage would be considered Black. There were a lot of people like her who were pretty fair skinned, right? But what it really comes down to is that these white fathers of her parents were also their enslavers. And so she recognized that Black women had suffered at the hands of rape at the hands of white men. And she wanted to call that out. And she did in public speeches. Every time she went to a predominantly white, these purity conferences, they expected her to talk about Black women's impurity, and she always turned it around on them to talk about the case for white men and women who had kind of allowed for the rape and sexual harassment of Black women in the times of enslavement and then afterwards.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that, the Mammy statue and how, or the, the bill to try to get one. Can you tell folks a little bit about how that went down? Either, I guess, Allison, maybe?
Okay, so I'll start,
okay.
and we can move on. But yeah, so the Senate actually passed, believe it or not, the U.S. Senate in 1923, a bill to put a Black Mammy monument up in Washington, D.C., and it was an idea of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who really were trying to promote that version of history that said that Blacks were contented in their enslavement and part of a happy, big family, and that they really loved their white charges and loved being mammies. And as Kathleen can confirm, there were a lot of Black women who were absolutely appalled when this passed the Senate. And obviously, Mary Church Terrell was one of them, and she wrote a stinging editorial and basically said, no Black woman ever wanted to be a mammy. She wanted to be a mother to her own children, who were often, torn away from her, sold away from her, or she wasn't able to actually nurture them because she was taking care of and nursing white women's children. And so she completely rejected it as a kind of a horrific idea. So Kathleen, I'm sure you have more to add on this.
Yeah, no, that's such an interesting moment, right? And coming right after 1920, when Black women in the North and West are able to vote, and Black women in the South certainly try to register and vote. And there's this real kind of emphasis on that passive and happy, as you say, enslaved woman. And Carrie Williams Clifford is clearly in many of the same spaces and conversations with Mary Church Terrell for this. And she writes a poem about the statue that is published in the African American newspaper in Washington. And it's a really scathing poem about how white women have no right to try to tell the history of Black women, and particularly this history, because it's false. And she also, one of her, she also talked a lot about the sexual violence of slavery. And again, she sees this history being rewritten, right? This is the moment of Birth of a Nation and, all of these kind of romanticizing of the antebellum period. And she's uses her poetry to push back against that. And she writes about that same kind of, the sexual violence and the violence of children being torn away from their enslaved mothers. And she puts that in the Mammy statue poem as well. So she's castigating the Daughters of the Confederacy, but she also turns it to white men and says, these weren't, Mammy couldn't take care of her own children who were also yours, So she's got a lot in this. It's an incredibly powerful poem.
Right. And we should say that this is a Senate that wouldn't pass an anti-legislation law, but anti-lynching, but they would. And so this idea of rewriting history, it resurfaces throughout your books. So there's a question here that I'll go ahead and get to it. Gosh, where our time is moving so fast. So this is a question for Dr. Cahill, and it's asking about in what ways is your book consciously engaging with Petrault's argument about the suffrage movement and historical memory? Oh, he's talking about the myth of Seneca Falls. And what intervention do you see your book making in the broader historiography about suffrage?
I mean, that's such a fantastic book, The Myth of Seneca Falls, and such a great example of historiography. And basically she's arguing that white suffragists, and particularly Stanton and Anthony, really shaped the narrative by writing their own history, right? That 6-volume history of women's suffrage. And that became kind of where historians would go to start writing about suffrage. And it was a really limited story because it focused on their organizations. It left out some, right? Like Lucy Stone and the American Women's Suffrage Association didn't talk about them, but it also really left out many women of color. There are a few African-American women in there, a couple women from Hawaii, Indigenous women. But for the most part, right, it's the narrative we were used to, right? And so what Tetrall, I think, does so fantastically is show us that that's only one story, and it was a really deliberate creation. And so, what I hope my book is doing is saying, well, here are some other stories. And the women in my book, as I said, with Clifford, right, not just her, but all of them are really aware of the power of history and the way that it was written to erase their communities. And in different ways, many of them tried to kind of write their own histories or save their own histories. Mariebotne Baldwin collects Native women's art. She writes a master's thesis on a history of Indian law that's basically a history of Native US relations. Carrie Williams is writing her poetry. Mabel Pinghua Lee actually writes, she gets her PhD in 1921. And she writes a dissertation that's a history of agriculture in China. So they're all very interested in history and their own, right, and talking about how their own communities have contributed to creating the US. And I think that's really key. And I wonder about Terrell. Is she doing it?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll let you just end that. I see there's another question is what I'm trying to say.
All
so
right,
I'm just
okay.
going to let it go to the next question.
Yeah. Oh, can you see it? Allison, do you want to go ahead and address it? Or
well, maybe you want to read it so that everybody can hear.
Yeah. Okay. So this question is about the 1921 Women's Rights Statute dedication in the Capitol Rotunda when the National Women's Party Convention met to decide the post-suffrage goals of the movement. And we're wondering if Mary Church Terrell's role in urging the NWP to prioritize addressing the disenfranchisement of Black women, even after ratification of the 19th Amendment, did she stay involved with the NWP, or what path did her feminism and activism take after 1920?
Right. Yeah. So Mary Church Terrell leads a delegation of women that goes to confront the National Women's Party, and specifically Alice Paul, after Black women and white women get the right to vote, because of the fact that they still don't want to let the National Association of Colored Women in as one of the member associations. And they claim that it's a racial organization, not a women's organization. So back to the same old line. And even in front of her with this argument saying, Black women have been participating fully in suffrage, that would be something important. Alice Paul refuses. However, Terrell had marched and picketed the White House with the NWP, and she persists whenever she feels that it's her goals are being met. She persists in the sense that if she wants to be an activist and that's a way to do it, she'll work with these white women who she clearly sees as racist. And so she continued to work with them because she liked the ERA. She wanted to have the Equal Rights Amendment passed. She believed in it, and she got the NACW on board with it. And she also testified repeatedly for decades in Congress to try to pass the ERA. So that was with Alice Paul. And she would have been the first one to say that she was prejudiced, but that didn't keep her from working with her.
Yeah. And that 1921 conference is a good example again. So the statue unveiling opens this conference that the National Women's Party holds, kind of a what next conference. And while Paul really resists having Black women there, she invites Gertrude Bonin to speak, and she invites a Chinese woman from the Chinese the legation connected to the ambassador in DC to speak. And so, right, two really different or three ways of engaging with women of color.
Yeah, I know we're getting close to time, but I think we're okay that we can go a little over, making sure that we answer anybody who has last minute questions. You can still submit them. But before we go, I do want to give you each a chance to think about to share what you hope is the impact of your book and how it might be really relevant in some of the more current contemporary conversations. I wonder, Allison, if you want to go first to
Sure.
reflect on that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we can take away from Mary Church Terrell and her incredibly long life of activism is that for especially young people to think about activism as a long-term, lifelong process and a project, and not something that you do for a minute or a few days or even a summer uprising of 2020 and think that everything will be changed. And so I think her example of persistence and determination and not giving up. So she had optimism to the end and did see changes within her lifetime, even though she also saw these setbacks. And so to me, that's the key of really understanding women's activism and activism in general as a whole lifetime of experience, and not, oh, somebody sat down once, they protested once, but really understanding how it fits within their life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I like to think that my book helps us understand someone like Vice President Kamala Harris, or our new Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, right, who's a member of Laguna Pueblo, and to understand that while they are firsts, right, and we talk about firsts, Haaland was one of the first 2 Native women elected to Congress. Harris is the first woman of color vice president, that they're really part of these long legacies, right? And someone, they would both, I think, and have acknowledged this when Harris accepts the nomination. She kind of listed, in Brittany Cooper's phrase, kind of the Black women who went before her, including Mary Church Terrell, but also her mother, right, who is an immigrant, an Asian immigrant, South Asian. So, and Deb Haaland talks about kind of her ancestors, and so they, right, and this is something that I try to say in the book, is like, to me, these stories were new, and to many of the people reading my book, they'll be new stories, but to the communities that these women were in, they were not new stories, right? And they knew those histories, and they kept those histories really alive. And so the women that we're talking about as firsts today are first in those positions, but really come out of these legacies that I hope will be, people will learn about from my work.
Awesome. Thank you. So I think that's a good place to end. I think that folks should be encouraged and inspired to read these books, because there's so much more in them that we didn't get to talk about today. So I do want to formally thank Alison and Kathleen for sharing with me and our audience and having such an insightful conversation. I also want to thank the libraries and our press colleagues, especially Katie Fanfani, Maria S. Storino, Nadia Clifton, and Ali Shea for everything they do to make the Off the Shelf series available. And another thank you to the audience, and to remind you that you can visit uncpress.org and use your 40% discount to buy these books. The Off the Shelf series continues next month. On Thursday, April 22nd at noon, we'll have Dr. Rachel Williams presenting Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed, the Detroit Uprising of 1943, which will be another great conversation with the authors. So with that, I hope you all have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Thank you.